Free speech, politics, and the dimensions of democracy. 1. Introduction. American politics at century's end. Our politics are a disgrace, and money is the root of the problem. Our politicians need, raise, and spend more and more money in each election cycle. The candidate who has or raises the most money, as the 1998 midterm elections demonstrated once again, almost always wins. Officials begin raising money for the next election the day after the last one, and often put more time and industry into that task than into those of which they were elected. They spend the bulk of the campaign money they raise, moreover, on television ads that are often negative and nearly always insane, substituting slogans and jingles for argument. The more money politicians need to be elected, the more they need rich contributors, and the more influence such contributors then have over their political decisions once elected. Federal law does limit how much individual citizens and groups can give to political campaigns, but new and larger loopholes make these limits less and less effective year by year. In recent years, candidates and anxious donors have exploited the soft money loophole, which permits donors, not just individuals but corporations and unions, which are otherwise prohibited from making political contributions, to make unlimited donations to political parties or committees. The parties spend that money on issue advocacy media campaigns that do not technically, in explicit terms, urge a vote for or against any candidate, but praise or denounce candidates with inhibited vigor, and often end by advising their audience to tell the denounced candidates to mend their ways. The issue advocacy device has eviscerated long-standing legal controls on political contributions. In the 1996 presidential election, both major party candidates used that loophole to avoid not only the contribution limits, but their legal obligation to observe voluntary spending limits on campaign expenditures in return for federal funding, and the New York Times called that election, for that reason, one of the most corrupt in American history. The staff of the Federal Election Commission recommended that both the Clinton and Dole campaigns be forced to refund contributions, but the full commission refused to accept the staff's advice, and their decision helps to guarantee that the 2000 presidential election will see yet another major escalation of the soft money device. Would-be presidential candidates in both parties have established political action committees of their own so that corporations, unions, and rich private individuals can donate huge sums to run issue ads for them and against their primary or general election opponents. Other democracies, appalled by the overweening importance of money in American elections, wonder why we do not simply place a ceiling, as they do, on the total amount that a candidate may legally spend in a particular election campaign. The most effective way to prevent money from dominating politics and to prevent powerful corporations, unions, and other groups from receiving favors for contributions is to lessen politicians' need for money, and the most effective way to do that is to limit what the politicians may spend. Congress did enact expenditure limits in 1974, following the Watergate scandals. But in less than 2 years, in Buckley versus Valeo, the Supreme Court ruled that expenditure limits are unconstitutional because they violate the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which provides that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or association. Prohibiting a politician or anyone else from spending as much money as he wishes to express his political convictions and policies, the court said, is restricting his freedom of speech. Regulating campaign expenditures would have raised many problems even if the court had upheld spending limits. But the experience of the other democracies I just mentioned, which do severely limit election expenditures, show that such limits are workable. Many constitutional scholars, though by no means all, believe that the Buckley ruling striking down expenditure limits was a mistake, and they hope that it will be overruled. It is optimistic to suppose, however, that Buckley will be flatly overruled, at least for some time. It is more plausible to imagine that as conviction spreads that the decision was a mistake, it will be reinterpreted and narrowed so as to permit more regulation. It is nevertheless important to pause over the question whether and, if so, why Berkeley was a mistake, because much of the criticism of the decision ignores the most powerful arguments in its favor. Until we identify those arguments, we cannot understand why the decision, which seems so wrong to so many scholars and lawyers, seemed so right to the Supreme Court and to so many other scholars and lawyers who continue to defend it. In fact, the legal and political disagreement over Berkeley is both deep and important, because whether we think the decision right or wrong depends on how we conceive the character of American democracy and the role of the First Amendment in defending and perfecting that democracy. Our answer to a philosophical question, what is the best conception of democracy, is likely to be decisive of whether we endorse or reject not only campaign expenditure limits, but other ways of regulating our electoral process. The argument to come. The strongest case for Berkeley's ruling that expenditure limits are unconstitutional depends on a popular strategic assumption about the best way to realize and protect democracy. I call this assumption, following the famous federal judge Learned Hand, the democratic wager. It holds that democracy is best protected by a principle that forbids government to limit or control political speech in any way for the purpose of protecting democracy. So it forbids laws that attempt to make elections fairer by limiting what rich candidates or parties can spend. That principle may seem paradoxical. How can it improve democracy to prevent government from restricting political speech when government believes that the restriction will itself improve democracy? But the wager supposes that constraints on political speech are likely to harm democracy even when they are enacted with the intent, real or feigned, of improving it. That is what Hand calls the bet on which we have staked our all. Staked our all. So it adopts the prophylactic technique of forbidding government to attempt to make our political system more democratic through that device. Even though government may regulate and restrict speech for other reasons, to protect national security, for example, or private reputation, it cannot regulate or restrict it for that particular reason. As the court said in Berkeley, in as explicit a statement of the democratic wager as any in the legal record, restricting the speech of some elements of our society in order to enhance the relative voice of others is wholly foreign to the First Amendment. If we accept the democratic wager, then we must acknowledge that very strong argument for the Berkeley ruling. Should we accept it? Perhaps we should if we conceive democracy, as many political theorists have, only as a political arrangement designed to enforce the will of the majority. But if we reject that majoritarian conception of democracy in favor of a more ambitious one that understands democracy as a partnership in collective self-government, in which all citizens are given the opportunity to be active and equal partners, then we should reject it. We should adopt instead a finer-grained and more discriminating, though still rigorous, test for deciding when government should be permitted to regulate political speech in the interests of democracy. That test would permit reasonable expenditure limits on political campaigns. It would make plain why Berkeley was wrong in principle and should now be overruled. I am not supposing that freedom of speech has only instrumental value, that it is nothing but a means to a more important end. On the contrary, that freedom is in itself a fundamental human right. Free speech and democracy are connected not instrumentally but in a deeper way, because the dignity that freedom of speech protects is an essential component of democracy rightly conceived. We cannot hope fully to understand either free speech or democracy, or properly to interpret the First Amendment as part of the Constitution as a whole, unless we interpret those values together, trying to understand the role each plays in the full account of the other. I expand on the claim that free speech and democracy are conceptually connected in that way in freedom's law. The assumption that the two ideas are bound together in that way is itself part of American constitutional practice. We treat the Constitution as constructing a distinctive form of democracy, and we assess the First Amendment as both contributing to and helping to define that form. Of course, free speech serves other purposes as well. Many people suppose, as John Stuart Mill did, that a society that adopts the free market strategy will be more effective in discovering truth, for example, than a society that rejects or qualifies it. But it is the connection between free speech and democracy that has been the nerve of First Amendment jurisprudence. I shall try to mitigate the abstraction of this jurisprudential discussion in two ways. First, I shall describe, at the outset, the general form of various proposals that critics have made for reforming American election law. The proposals can serve as both illustrations and tests of principles I discuss, and at the end, we can consider how we might evaluate these proposals if Berkeley were no longer an obstacle to their implementation. Although Congress is unlikely to enact any of these proposals in the present political climate, it will be revealing to examine how the choice among the different conceptions of democracy that I shall describe affects the desirability, in principle, of reforms of these different kinds. Second, in the discussion to come, we need to ask not merely which conception of democracy and of the rule of free speech in protecting democracy is superior as a matter of abstract political morality, but which conception and rule offers a better interpretation of American constitutional and legal practice. So I shall illustrate and refine the theoretical claims by attempting to interpret selected Supreme Court decisions, including Berkeley, in their light. 2. Proposed reforms. Familiar proposals for reform can be grouped under four headings. 1. Expenditure caps. Overall expenditures by parties and candidates should be limited to stipulated sums during each election period. The expenditure ceiling must be generous enough to enable little-known candidates and parties to bring themselves and their positions to the public's attention, but low enough that candidates and parties without access to enormous funds are not driven from the field. 2. Contributions and coordinated expenditures. Individuals should continue to be limited in their contributions to political campaigns and parties, and expenditures that are coordinated with a particular candidate's campaign must count against that limit. Coordination is defined, for this purpose, to include any consultation with or solicitation of advice from a candidate's advertising, polling, and strategic organizations, as well as other parts of the campaign staff. The soft money loophole should be eliminated. 3. Independent expenditures. Individuals and PACs should of course continue to be free to spend their own funds on political advocacy. But during an election period, each individual's expenditure on advocacy that mentions a political party or a candidate for national office should be subject to a further and distinct limit. Such expenditures made during an election period by an advocacy committee or group to which an individual has contributed should be charged, to the extent of that contribution, to that individual's overall limit. 4. Conditional public funding for political broadcasts. Generous public campaign funds should be made available to candidates and parties, but only to those who agree not to run during the election period. Ordinary campaign commercials, the short advertisements run in breaks in regular programming on radio or television that have become a staple of our elections. Those who accept such funds would be free to run longer, more substantive political broadcasts on behalf of a candidate or party during that period. Such political broadcasts would be freestanding programs not broadcast in commercial slots within other broadcasts, of at least 3 minutes duration, in which a candidate or officer in a political party speaks to camera or microphone for the bulk of the broadcast. Such funds should be offered, subject to that condition, equally to the major parties, and to other parties in a proposition fixed by evidence of public support. The first 3 proposals directly address the role of money in our elections by imposing limits on campaign expenditures and contributions. The 4th proposal goes further, imposing conditions designed to affect the form of electronic media politics. It draws a line between some media of expression, television and radio, and the rest, and it aims not just to reduce the impact of money on elections overall, but to improve the character and quality of the political debate by eliminating soundbite political commercials. The 4th proposal is therefore more troublesome than the first 3, because the First Amendment is particularly hostile to efforts to regulate the content of political speech, and encouraging politicians to substitute substantive argument for soundbites might be considered an attempt to regulate content. Though expenditures caps do limit the quantity of political speech, they are nevertheless neutral as to the form of the political messages that the permitted expenditures may be used to publish. The conditions imposed in the last proposal are not neutral in that sense. They pick out electronic media for special restriction, not through flat prohibition, to be sure, but as a condition on a public grant and the restriction is designed to affect the form of political speech by making it more argumentative, though not to discriminate in favor of or against any particular political party or position or conviction. The last proposal raises First Amendment issues that might well be thought grave even if Buckley were overruled. 3. What is democracy? Democracy is extraordinarily popular now around the world, but people disagree about what democracy is. When these disagreements cross cultures, they are often formidable. Some leaders claim, for example, that a non-party state with only state-controlled press and media, whose elections are formalities, comes closest to realizing the democratic idea. Even within the mature Western democracies, the disagreements are considerable. Some Americans believe that judicial review of legislation by courts, which have the power to declare such legislation unconstitutional, undermines democracy. Others hold that judicial review helps to perfect it. Americans and Europeans disagree about whether proportional representation or federalism or voter initiatives of various kinds make representative government more or less democratic. The near-universal agreement that democracy is the only acceptable form of government hides deeper disagreements of that character. Many of the disagreements among constitutional lawyers about the proper understanding of the First Amendment, including the argument about the constitutionality of campaigns expenditure limits, are best explained as consequences of these more general disagreements about democracy. Of course, few lawyers have formulated an explicit conception of democracy. They rely on an intuitive sense of what democracy is. But some of these intuitive understandings are strikingly different from others. Democracy, we all say, means government by the people rather than by some family or class or some tyrant or general. But government by the people can be understood in two radically different ways. On one view, the majoritarian conception, it means government by the largest number of the people. On this majoritarian view, the democratic ideal lies in a match between political decision and the will of the majority or plurality of opinion. We can construct different versions of that general account of democracy. One is a populist version. A state is democratic, according to that version, to the degree to which government enacts the law or pursues the policy that is actually favored by the largest number of citizens at the time. A more sophisticated version of the majoritarian conception, however, insists that the majority's opinion does not count as its will unless citizens have had an adequate opportunity to become informed and to deliberate about the issues. A state is democratic on that more sophisticated account when its institutions give citizens that opportunity and then allow a majority of citizens to select the officials whose policies match their will. That sophisticated account is plenty more attractive than the populist one, and I shall have the sophisticated account in mind when I refer, in the rest of this chapter, to the majoritarian conception of democracy. Thank you. I shall call the rival, very different, conception of democracy the partnership conception. According to the partnership conception, government by the people means government by all the people, acting together as full and equal partners in a collective enterprise of self-government. This is a more abstract and problematic conception than the majoritarian one, and, as we shall see, it is more difficult to state crisply what it takes to be the democratic ideal. But we should note immediately one fundamental and relevant difference between the majoritarian and partnership conceptions of democracy. Citizens play two main roles in a mature democracy. They are, first, the judges of political contests whose verdicts, expressed in formal elections or in referenda or other forms of direct legislation, are normally decisive. Public opinion means the relevant opinions of citizens acting in this capacity. Citizens are also, however, participants in the political contests they judge. They are candidates and supporters whose actions help, in different ways, to shape public opinion and to fix how the rest of the citizens vote. The majoritarian conception of democracy pays exclusive attention to the first of these roles. It insists, in the more sophisticated version I described, that, so far as this is feasible, the informed and reflective opinions of the largest number should be decisive of who is elected to government and of what government once elected does. But it says nothing further about the role that individual citizens and groups must be allowed to play in shaping the opinions of others. The partnership conception recognizes both roles because it supposes that in a true democracy, citizens must play a part as equal partners in a collective enterprise, in shaping as well as constituting the public's opinion. 4. Democracy and free speech. A. Free speech and the majoritarian ideal. Free speech plays an evident role in the majoritarian conception. That understanding of democracy requires that citizens be given an opportunity to inform themselves as fully as possible and to deliberate, individually and collectively, about their choices, and it is a compelling strategic judgment that the best way to provide that opportunity is to permit anyone who wishes to address the public to do so, in whatever way and at whatever length he wishes, no matter how unpopular or unworthy the government or other citizens deem his message to be. Of course, that strategy cannot be absolute. Free speech must sometimes yield to other values, including security and, perhaps, a private interest in reputation. In such cases, laws forbidding or regulating speech may have the incidental result of influencing the public's verdict on officials or their policies. But this is a regrettable side effect of constraints adopted for reasons quite independent of that effect. Regulations that are intended to improve democracy, however, like the various proposals for electoral reform that I described earlier, deliberately aim at changing public opinion in some way. They do not aim that the public reach a different overall verdict in any particular election. But since they attack what they take to be defects in the formation of public opinion, they do aim that the content of public opinion be different from what it would otherwise have been. Reformers want to limit campaign spending, for example, because they think that rich candidates and groups now have too much power to mold public opinion their way. They therefore assume that limiting what the rich can spend would make a difference in what at least some members of the public come to believe or want. Such limits would not, perhaps, favor one party or one political perspective. They might well be, in the language of constitutional lawyers, viewpoint neutral. But they would certainly alter public opinion. That is, after all, their point. The proposals raise the following question of the majoritarian model. Is it consistent with that conception of democracy to permit legal restrictions that decrease the overall volume of electoral speech when such restrictions have, as their goal, that public opinion be different from what it would be without such restrictions? The majoritarian conception tests any proposed electoral structure by asking whether that structure reveals what a majority of citizens would choose after the fullest possible opportunity for information and reflection. If we are to make that test workable, however, we need to specify more precisely what conditions provide that fullest possible opportunity. What structure of public debate and argument would be ideal for that purpose? How close does any particular structure come to meeting that ideal? We might consider a result-oriented answer. Ideal conditions, we might say, are those that make it most probable that citizens will vote in accordance with their true or authentic interests. We can make some sense of this suggestion if we will limit our concern to citizens' narrow economic interests. We might think that certain tax or other economic policies would actually work against the economic interests of most citizens. For example, even though we know that politicians with enough money to spend on advertising might persuade them of the contrary, and we might intelligibly consider which forms of electoral regulation would best guard against such deception. It is hard to predict what such a result-oriented study might indicate. We might decide, for example, that a scheme that gave all parties and candidates equal time to argue their case would give citizens the best chance of reaching the right conclusions. Or we might reach some more surprising and unattractive conclusion, for instance, that a scheme that disqualified rich candidates from speaking at all would provide the best protection. We need not pursue these possibilities, however, because in any case a result-oriented strategy could not take account of the interests and convictions citizens have beyond their own narrow economic self-interest. It could not take account of their convictions about economic justice, or foreign policy, or abortion, for instance. For it makes no sense to think that there is an underlying fact of the matter about what a particular citizen's true or authentic political or social or moral convictions are, a fact that can be determined without his answering a question or voting. Since any such poll or vote must take place after a particular, even if minimal, public discussion, we cannot establish which structure of discussion is most likely to produce true answers without begging the question in favor of some such structure. So we need a different strategy for refining the test the majoritarian conception deploys, and we must seek this in some combination of two areas. First, assumptions about the conditions of good reasoning generally, and second, assumptions that underlie the majoritarian conception of democracy itself. We know from experience, first, that certain intellectual practices and environments are more likely than others to produce good reasoning about a wide variety of matters. Scientists, historians, and people facing practical decisions all do better, for example, when they base their conclusions on a wide rather than a restricted set of pertinent data, and when they have reflected on and tested these conclusions over time rather than settling on them precipitously. We have no reason not to assume that these general conditions of good reasoning apply to political judgments as well as to everything else. So the majoritarian conception can endorse any government intervention in the political process, subsidies for publicizing under-financed or unpopular opinions, for example, that provides the public with access to information, argument, or appeal that it would not otherwise have. It might seem tempting to use a similar argument in favor of expenditure limits. We might argue that the public will reason better if it hears no more from one side than from any other. But that argument, on reflection, is very weak. True, we can imagine circumstances in which limiting the advertising of a rich candidate would prevent voters from being misled in some way. Such limits might prevent a well-financed candidate from broadcasting mendacious advertisement in so many areas that less well-financed rivals could not reply to all of them, for example. But we can as easily imagine circumstances in which such limits would prevent some voters from receiving information they would value. Even a political message endlessly repeated on television is seen on each repetition by at least someone who had not yet seen it, and that message might seem valuable to that voter. So we cannot say, in general and in advance, that reducing the overall quantity of political information in order to make the influence of all candidates more equal would improve the ability of voters to think clearly. In any case, we could not support that suggestion, as we can support the idea that the more information voters have the better, by appeal to general principles about good methods of reflection. No scientist or historian or practical decision-maker would avoid reading all material arguing for one hypothesis or decision just because more literature was available for that hypothesis or decision than for its rivals, even if he knew that the group that had produced more literature was for some irrelevant reason better financed. He might well take that latter fact into account in evaluating what he read, but he would not limit his reading for that reason. He would trust his own tutor judgment. Very interesting, this author, because he wants to treat people as scientists. He wants to educate people to think like scientists. It is true that in some contexts, appellate legal arguments and formal debates, for example, each side is given equal time, but those contexts are special in two pertinent ways. First, the overall time set aside for an appellate argument or a formal debate is fixed, so that time taken by one side is necessarily lost by the other. In contrast, though as a practical matter the time any particular voter has available for politics is limited, no such limit is formal or rigid, and allowing rich candidates to broadcast more often does not mean that voters are unable to pay as much attention to whatever advertising a poorer candidate can offer as they could if expenditure were equal. Second, equal time regulations in legal arguments and formal debates are mainly justified in independent concerns about fairness to the parties or participants. It is fair to the participants that no side have a greater opportunity to make its case than any other. That concern for fairness is distinct from any concern for accuracy or good reasoning. It is recognized by the partnership conception of democracy, but not by the majoritarian conception whose implications we are now considering. The second body of ideas on which a majoritarian conception might draw to help define ideal conditions of political argument is democratic theory itself. The democratic claim that the people must be left free to judge for themselves and not have their minds made up for them by any official or caste means that citizens must have that freedom as individuals. It is not consistent with that assumption to allow the legislature, even representing the will of the majority, to dictate to individual citizens what it is appropriate for them to attend to in considering how to vote. It is not consistent for the legislature to prevent individual citizens from watching as many political advertisements of a particular candidate as that candidate is willing and able to provide. The Berkeley Court put the point, once again, with the clarity that makes its decision such a crisp endorsement of the majoritarian conception. In the free society ordained by our Constitution, it is not the government, but the people, individually as citizens and candidates and collectively as associations and political committees, who must retain control over the quantity and range of debate on public issues in a political campaign. On the majoritarian conception, the only argument for limiting the quantity of political debate is the paternalistic and unacceptable one that people will think more clearly if government limits what they hear. No such assumption is necessary on the partnership conception, because that conception justifies expenditure limits by appealing to an independent concern for fairness among political contestants. So neither of the two grounds that a proponent of the majoritarian conception might consider for accepting expenditure limits, general assumptions about the conditions of good reasoning and general presumptions embedded in the majoritarian conception itself, offers any persuasive argument for such limits. On the contrary, together they make a powerful, and some might think a compelling, case for the democratic wager that I described earlier, the wager on which the Berkeley decision was premised. B. The partnership conception. The three dimensions of democracy. The majoritarian conception of democracy is very popular. It is the conception most frequently endorsed by political scientists and philosophers, and it is therefore hardly surprising that the Berkeley ruling against expenditure limits should have struck many lawyers and judges as correct. The equally widespread impression that the Berkeley ruling is wrong, however, suggests that many other lawyers and laymen reject that conception of democracy, at least intuitively. I have elsewhere argued that the majoritarian conception is radically defective. See the introduction to Freedom's Law. Almost all of us think that democracy is a valuable, even indispensable, form of government. We think that it is worth fighting and perhaps even dying to protect. We need a conception of democracy that matches that sense of democracy's value. We need an understanding that shows us what is so good about democracy. The majoritarian conception fails to do this, because there is nothing inherently valuable about a process that allows a large number of people to impose its will on a smaller number. Majority rule is not fair or valuable in itself. It is fair and valuable only when certain conditions are met, including requirements of equality among participants in the political process through which majority will is determined. So we must now explore the rival partnership conception of democracy, which insists on recognizing these conditions as essential to true democracy. On the partnership conception, institutions are democratic to the degree that they allow citizens to govern themselves collectively through a partnership in which each is an active and equal partner. That aim, as I considered, is a very abstract one, and it might be realized, more or less well, through very different packages of institutions. British democracy is differently structured from American democracy, and both are differently structured from South African democracy. But they all grant some measure of partnership democracy, even though none grants a full measure. We test how well any society has succeeded in creating a partnership democracy not by holding its institutions to a single standard, like the standard I constructed to illustrate the majoritarian construction, but against a more complex set of ideals encompassing different dimensions. The first dimension of partnership democracy is popular sovereignty, which is a relation between the public as a whole and the various officials who make up its government. Partnership democracy demands that the people, rather than the officials, be masters. The revolutionary slogans that demanded equality when modern democracy began in the 18th century had that kind of equality in mind. Democracy's enemy, then, was privileged by inheritance or caste. The majoritarian conception demands popular sovereignty too, but it defines this not as a relation between the people generally and their officials, but as the power of the largest number of citizens finally to have their way. The second dimension of partnership democracy is citizen equality. I don't feel well. In a democracy, citizens, though collectively sovereign, are also, as individuals, participants in the contests they collectively judge. Citizen equality demands that they participate as equals. The distinct importance of that dimension of equality became evident only later in democracy's story, when it was no longer controversial that the people as a whole, rather than some monarch or despot, should have the final power of government, but it nevertheless remained unclear how that collective power should be distributed among citizens individually, who should be allowed to vote and speak in the various processes through which collective political decisions are made and public opinion and culture are formed. It is now settled among mature democracies that, in principle, all mature citizens, with very few exceptions, should have equal voting impact. The majoritarian conception of democracy insists on equal suffrage because only in that way can elections hope to measure the will of the largest number of citizens. The partnership conception insists on equal suffrage too, but it requires that citizens be equal not only as judges of the political process, but as participants in it as well. That does not mean that each citizen must have the same influence over the minds of other citizens. On this point, and for general observations about equality of influence as a democratic goal, see Chapter 4. It is inevitable and desirable that some citizens will have greater influence because their voices are particularly cogent or moving, or because they are particularly admired, or have devoted their lives to politics and public service, or have taken up careers or investments in journalism. Special influence that is gained in these ways is not in itself incompatible with the partnership understanding of democracy. In a society of greatly unequal wealth and other resources, some citizens will have much greater opportunity to occupy each of these positions of heightened influence only because they are richer, and that is indeed an insult to citizen equality. But that more general unfairness could not be ended except through a vast redistribution of wealth and what wealth brings. The more specific unfairness that brings influence to the rich only because they can afford large contributions to politicians could be ended or minimized through the simple expedient of expenditure limits. On the contrary, democracy could not succeed on its third dimension, which I introduce in the next paragraph, unless it encouraged special influence on at least some of those grounds. But partnership democracy is damaged when some groups of citizens have no or only a sharply diminished opportunity to appeal for their convictions because they lack the funds to compete with rich and powerful donors. No one can plausibly regard himself as a partner in an enterprise of self-government when he is effectively shut out from the political debate because he cannot afford a grotesquely high admission price. The third dimension of democracy is democratic discourse. Genuine collective actions requires interaction. If the people are to govern collectively in a fashion that makes each citizen a partner in the political enterprise, then they must deliberate together as individuals before they act collectively, and the deliberation must center on reasons for and against that collective action, so that citizens who lose on an issue can be satisfied that they had a chance to convince others and failed to do so, not merely that they have been outnumbered. Democracy cannot provide any genuine form of self-government if citizens are not able to speak to the community in a structure and climate that encourages attention to the merits of what they say. If the public discourse is crippled by censorship, or collapses into a shouting or slandering match in which each side tries only to distort or drown out what the others say, then there is no collective self-government, no collective enterprise of any kind, but only vote counting as war by other means. This brief account of partnership democracy is a tripartite idealization, of course. No nation has achieved or could achieve perfect control of officials by citizens, perfect political equality among citizens, or a political discourse unsullied by irrationality. America does not have full popular sovereignty because our government still has great powers to keep dark what it does not want us to know. We do not have full citizen equality because money, which is unjustly distributed, counts for far too much in politics. We do not have even a respectable democratic discourse. Our politics is closer to the war described than to any civic argument. But we must keep the tripartite ideal in mind in judging, as now we must, what role the First Amendment could sensibly be assigned in improving democracy and the partnership conception, in bringing it at least closer to the unattainable pure case of that form of government. C. Free speech in a democratic partnership. Each of the three dimensions of a nation's democracy, on the partnership conception, is affected by the constitutional and legal arrangements it makes to encourage and protect political speech. Popular sovereignty demands that the people rather than officials have final power of government. But if officials are allowed to punish criticism of their decisions as sedition, or to forbid the publication of information that might lead to such criticism, or to shut down new parties or newspapers that might expose their mistakes or crimes, then the people are not, or not fully, in charge. So a constitutional structure that guarantees freedom of speech against official censorship protects citizens in their democratic role as sovereigns. Free speech helps to protect citizen equality as well. It is essential to democratic partnership that citizens be free, in principle, to express any relevant opinion they have, no matter how much those opinions are rejected or hated or feared by other citizens. Much of the pressure for censorship in contemporary democracies is generated not by any official attempt to keep secrets from the people, but by the desire of a majority of citizens to silence others whose opinions they despise. That is the ambition of groups, for example, who want laws preventing neo-Nazis from marching or racists from parading in white sheets. But such laws disfigure democracy, because if a majority of citizens has the power to refuse a fellow citizen the right to speak whenever it deems his ideas dangerous or offensive, then he is not an equal in the argumentative competition for power. We must permit every citizen whom we claim bound by our laws an equal voice in the process that produces those laws, even when we rightly detest his convictions, or we forfeit our right to impose our laws upon him. Freedom of speech enforces that principle, and so protects citizen equality. Some argue that the expression of opinions derogatory of a race or ethnic group or gender, often called hate speech, itself ensures citizen equality because it not only offends the citizens who are its targets, but damages their own ability to participate in politics as equals. Racist speech, for example, is said to silence the racial minorities who are its targets. The empirical force of that large generalization is uncertain. It is unclear how great an impact such speech has and on whom. But in any case, it would be a serious misunderstanding of citizen equality and of the partnership conception of democracy in general to suppose that allowing even psychologically damaging political opinions free circulation offends the equality in question. Citizen equality cannot demand that citizens be protected by censorship even from those beliefs, convictions, or opinions that make it more difficult for them to gain attention for their views in an otherwise fair political contest, or that damage their own opinion of themselves. We could not possibly generalize a right to such protection. A fundamentalist Christian, for example, could not be protected in that way without banning speech or the expression of opinion altogether. We must collectively attack prejudice and bias, but not in that way. Two seconds. 2 minutes, 2 secondes. Whoop. Citizen equality does require, however, that different groups of citizens not be disadvantaged in their effort to gain attention and respect for their views by a circumstance so remote from the substance of opinion or argument, or from the legitimate sources of influence as wealth is. Experience has shown, and never more dramatically than in recent elections, that any group's political success is so directly related to the sheer magnitude of its expenditures, particularly on television and radio, that this factor dwarfs others in accounting for political success. That is the heart of the democratic argument for expenditure limits in political campaigns. The connection between freedom of speech and the third dimension of democracy, democratic discourse, is also complex. Some regulations of speech that a government might be tempted to adopt, including laws limiting the investigative powers of the media, would damage the democratic discourse by denying it information and diversity. But the degradation of our public discourse by moronic political commercials that make no arguments beyond repetitive slogans and jingles also compromises the argumentative character of our discourse, and certain forms of indirect regulation of that discourse, such as the last proposal in my list, might help to arrest that damage. So the connection between a constitutional guarantee of free speech and the quality of a partnership democracy on its different dimensions is a complicated and delicate one. If we were constructing such a guarantee as part of a new constitution, we would have to choose among three strategies: the democratic wager I described earlier, a balancing approach that would permit regulations of political speech that damaged democracy on one of its dimensions but improved it on another when the combined effect was thought to enhance democracy overall, or a more discriminating approach that combined elements of each of these two strategies. Should we permit a balancing approach that allows regulations that impair democracy on one dimension when these are calculated to improve democracy overall? The case for such balancing might seem, in the abstract, a strong one. A guarantee of free speech cannot, in any case, be absolute. We cannot prohibit otherwise reasonable regulations that are necessary to protect national security or, perhaps, private reputation. We would be likely to sustain regulations for less urgent reasons, moreover. We would presumably permit time and place restrictions, like those forbidding broadcasting from soundtracks at night. If constraints like these are acceptable because they serve a useful purpose and do not detract from democracy overall, then why should we not make exceptions for other regulations that actually improve democracy overall? But there are two powerful answers to that simple argument. First, the different dimensions of democracy cannot be collapsed into one overriding goal that allows trading off violations on one dimension for overall gains. In particular, citizen equality is a matter of individual right, and we could not justify violations of that right by censoring racists on the ground that this would improve democratic discourse, for example, through any aggregating calculation. Second, any such exception would be peculiarly open to abuse. There would be a standing danger that government would attempt to crush strident new parties or powerful critics in the name of democratic discourse or citizen equality, as, after all, totalitarian governments have often done elsewhere. Congress or a state legislature might disqualify a party whose message is declared dangerous to popular sovereignty because it was confusing, for example. These fears justify rejecting a balancing strategy. Should we then accept the democratic wager? Are the dangers I just described so great that we should insist that though government may regulate political speech for a number of compelling reasons, it may never do so in order, in its judgment, to improve democracy itself? Our constitution, we might say, should commit us to the prophylactic judgment that democracy is best served, in the long run, by a rule that forbids government any power to try to improve it, from time to time, by compromising the freedom of people to say what they like when and as often as they like. Justice Scalia set out that argument in characteristically vivid language in 1990. He referred to the idea that too much speech is an evil that the democratic majority can proscribe, and he declared that that idea is incompatible with the absolutely central truth of the First Amendment, that government cannot be trusted to assure, through censorship, the fairness of political debate. Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce. If we accepted this caution, we would make the democratic wager part of our constitutional law. This argument for the democratic wager has two parts. The first is a diagnosis of danger, that the most significant threat to democracy, even now, lies in government's desire to protect itself and to cheat citizens of their democratic sovereignty by filtering and choosing what the public may watch or read or learn, and by attempting to justify that illegitimate control by claiming, as many tyrannies have indeed claimed, that this control is necessary to protect democracy in some other dimension. The second part is the maxim of strategy. It supposes that the best protection from that threat lies in prophylactic overkill, that is, in a doctrine that absolutely forbids government to appeal to that kind of justification for constraining speech even when the legitimacy of the appeal seems obvious. But though history supports both the plausibility of that fear and the wisdom of such a strategy, we can no longer afford to ignore the opposite dangers, particularly in the electronic age, of the wholly unregulated political discourse. We must compare the danger that a less rigid constitutional guarantee will allow an ingenious government to cheat the public of information and argument it should have, even if the courts are vigilant to prevent such abuse, with the rival danger that more rigid protection will allow wealth and privilege grossly undemocratic power, and allow the political discourse to be so cheapened as altogether to lose its argumentative character. The signs of exactly that decay are now too obvious to be set aside. We have as much a parody of democracy as democracy itself. In the 1996 and 1998 elections, political expenditures ballooned to formerly incredible sums, and politicians at every level, including the president and vice president, were forced to abase themselves before rich donors. Yes. Politicians continue the relentless, draining chase for money even while they call for rules that would make this unnecessary. For many politicians, the situation is a classic prisoner's dilemma. Each would prefer expenditures to be limited, but if they are not limited, each must struggle to raise and spend as much as possible. Poorer would-be candidates are driven from the field at every level, and groups representing convictions unpopular among the rich are not able even to begin assembling wide political support. Elected officials must begin the search for fresh money the morning after their election, and the intense and continuing effort seriously erodes the time they have for the public's business. The money these politicians raise is spent under the direction of pollsters and consultants who have no interest in principle or policy and whose skills lie only in the seduction of consumers by repetition, jingle, and soundbite. The consequence is the most degraded and negative political discourse in the democratic world. Public participation in politics, measured even by the number of citizens who bother to vote, has sunk below the level at which we can claim, with a straight face, to be governing ourselves. The public traces its own disaffection to the process itself. It reports that the power of money in politics has made it cynical and that the coarseness of television politics has made it sick. The prophylactic overkill of the democratic wager is now far too expensive in genuine democracy. It is now foolish rather than cautious, blind rather than wise. So we have powerful grounds for trying to construct a strategy for the protection of political speech that has something of the flexibility but not the danger of the balancing strategy. The discriminating strategy, as I shall call it, acknowledges that danger and forbids any regulation of speech that appreciably damages either citizen sovereignty or citizen equality. It does not allow government to compromise popular sovereignty by forbidding the press to discuss the sexual lives of officials, for example, even though it is highly plausible that the third dimension of democracy, democratic discourse, would be improved by that constraint. It rejects, as incompatible with citizen equality, the argument I mentioned that racist or sexist speech should be forbidden in order to avoid silencing minority groups or women, or in order to improve the character of political discourse. I have argued this point at some length in Freedom's Law, Chapter 9 and 10. But the discriminating strategy does permit regulations of political speech that improve democracy on some dimension when the defect that they aim to repair is substantial, and when the constraint works no genuine damage to either citizen sovereignty or citizen equality. Fine, thank you, and you. So it permits ceilings on campaign expenditures when these help to repair significant citizen inequality in politics, provided the ceilings are set high enough that they do not dampen criticism of government, and that no new inequality is introduced by foreclosing on familiar parties or candidates. 5. The legal record. A. The issue framed. I have been examining the philosophical basis for the democratic wager on which the Supreme Court based its Buckley ruling. I will close my door. 2 seconds. So, that prophylactic strategy flows naturally from the majoritarian conception that takes the nerve of democracy to lie in government according to the informed and reflective will of the majority. Some critics of Buckley have said that the decision represents a return of the Lochner mentality. Thank you. Lochner striking law that imposed a cap on the number of hours an employer could require a laborer to work. Mentality that once led the Supreme Court to reject progressive social and economic legislation on the ground that people had a right to use their property and spend their money as they wished. But the Lochner analogy misunderstands the true appeal of the prophylactic reading, which rests not on the almost universally rejected view that people with money should always be free to spend it as they wish, but on the much more popular idea that democracy means government by majority will. If democracy has only that single dimension, then the democratic wager might well be deemed a good bet. The majoritarian conception is not, however, the only available conception of democracy. The partnership conception is a more attractive alternative. That conception offers at least 3 dimensions on which democracy must be tested, and it recommends not the democratic wager, but the more discriminating interpretation of free speech that I described. If we were constructing a new constitution on a clean slate, we would have powerful reasons for constructing it with a partnership democracy in mind, and for drafting a discriminating protection of free speech. But we are not drafting a new constitution. We are attempting to interpret the constitution we have, and the history of practice and adjudication under it. So we must ask, which conception of democracy provides a better interpretation of our own constitutional structure and practice? I have elsewhere argued that the partnership conception does, because that conception explains what the majoritarian conception cannot, the Constitution's provision of individual rights against a democratic majority. See the introduction to Dworkin, Freedom's Law. True, some of those rights could be explained as necessary to create and protect even a majoritarian democracy. As John Hartley argues in Democracy and Distrust, a theory of judicial review. If you read the First Amendment as incorporating the democratic wager, then we could treat a citizen's right to free speech as a right protecting a majoritarian democracy, in spite of the fact that it limits what a democratic majority can do. But the Constitution contains individual rights, like the right to equal protection of the laws as this has been interpreted by the courts, that cannot be reconciled with the majoritarian conception of democracy in that way. We could do well, Sovereign Virtue by Ronald Dworkin. We could do well, however, for this occasion, to frame our interpretive question more narrowly. We should confine ourselves to First Amendment jurisprudence and distinguish between 2 readings of the Free Speech Clause. The first is prophylactic reading modeled on the democratic wager. It declares that political speech may never be restricted or regulated in the interests of democracy. The second is a more flexible reading drawn from the partnership conception. It allows regulation of free speech that improves citizen equality provided it meets the rigorous standards of the discriminating strategy that I described. Which of the 2 readings seems better to explain what the Constitution says or what the courts have done about free speech? B. Text and rhetoric. We get little help in choosing between those 2 interpretive readings from the Constitution's text. The First Amendment provides that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It is possible to read that language in an absolutist way as forbidding regulation of speech for any reason whatsoever. But both the democratic wager and the discriminating strategy reject that absolutist interpretation, as do almost all scholars and judges, and the text provides no further guidance as to the choice between those 2 readings. If the text permits regulation of speech to protect national security or the peace and quiet of neighborhoods, then it also permits, just as a matter of the bounds of language, regulation to protect our perfect democracy. Nor is judicial rhetoric decisive in either direction. The flat declaration in Buckley that concerns for equality are foreign to the First Amendment is, as I said, a clear endorsement of the democratic wager, but we can find even better known statements that equally clearly endorse the rival discriminating strategy. Chief among these is Justice Brandeis' famous statement in his Whitney opinion. Those who won... Yes, I sing. Those who I sing, I dance, I write. I play piano. I draw a bit. Those who won our independence believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty both as an end and as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty, that the greatest menace to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government. Whitney, California. Thank you. I don't know if I do that good, but I do that. This statement recognizes the importance of popular sovereignty, but it also lays particular emphasis, as part of an overall justification of the First Amendment, on the other dimensions of democracy, on the importance of citizen equality, and, above all, on the value of a deliberative democratic discourse. It declares that the point of freedom of speech is not just to stop government from oppressing the people, but to allow individual citizens to develop their faculties, that liberty is for this reason a democratic end as well as a means to other democratic purposes, and that civic deliberation with others is a political duty that stands beside the duty, as citizen sovereign, to vote. It would be bizarre to accept that strong endorsement of the varied goals of the First Amendment and yet to insist that it must never be interpreted or applied to further those goals. So we must look beyond text and rhetoric to evaluate our rival readings as interpretations of judicial practice. We must look to the actual decisions in those cases in which the two readings compete. There are not many such cases. Most First Amendment decisions are consistent with both readings. Both readings justify New York Times versus Sullivan, v. Sullivan. The Pentagon Papers decision. I already did that sometimes, maybe mostly on my social media. Pentagon Papers decision. The Slocum case. Colin v. Smith. The flag burning cases. Texas v. Johnson. And most of the other First Amendment landmarks. I shall concentrate on a number of those relatively few cases in which the two readings do pull in opposite directions, to see which reading's gravitational force proved the stronger in each case. That question is not settled by the language of the opinions in question, which almost never addresses our question directly. We shall have to look at what American courts have actually done in these cases, against the background of the facts presented to them, to judge which of the two readings better explains what they did. I will make a pause. So, see you later, probably in the evening, in France, because I'm French, in case you didn't hear at my accent.